Yep.
Okay, super. Great. I'm excited because what I prepared follows on really nicely from what Francois was speaking to. He mentioned some of the Lightstone data, and CAHF actually purchases the Lightstone data to do analysis of metro residential property markets and across the country. So we've recently obtained the data for the end of 2023. So this is quite recent, and it gives you a nice picture of what's happening out there, both in the market overall, as well as in affordable housing specifically. So if we look, as Francois was saying, somewhere around 6 million properties, 6.9 million properties, residential properties in South Africa right now. And again, Francois had mentioned this, but you can see what's in the pie graph here is a segmentation by value of the properties. And the lowest value is in our work is under 300,000, which is the green. And then the blue is 300 to 600, and the light blue is 600 to 900. So we can see already that about 66%, almost 2/3 of those properties are valued under 900,000. So it's 2/3 right there. So again, this underlines the point Francois was making that the lower end of the market is the market. It's nearly 2/3 of the market. About 76%, 3/4, are under 1.2 million. So of course it depends on the definition of affordable housing. But I think the important point is nearly 3/4 of the market is at the lower end. It isn't these massive properties that we see in Waterfall. 29% are entry level, which means they're less than 300,000. Now within that green segment that you're seeing, nearly 70% of those were built by government. Those are government subsidized properties. So the bottom end of the market is almost entirely dependent on the public investment that we've made into the residential property market at the lower end. Now, of course, urbanization has a massive role to play in driving demand for housing, obviously in urban areas. So we can see in the recent census that 40% of the population is in the metros, those 8 metros. And about 68% of the total value of the market is sitting in those 8 metros. And the UN Habitat data is showing us that urbanization is the rate of urbanization is actually slowly declining. So the rate remains positive. So our urban areas are growing, but the rate at which they're growing is slowly dropping. So we look specifically at what we call government subsidized properties. So that's essentially your RDP units. And we identify them in the Lightstone data using a proxy. So we can see that the government subsidized properties, the GSP, are a massive part of this existing market. So nearly 1/3 of properties that exist on the deeds data at the deeds office in South Africa were built by government, were subsidized by government. So we would be the residential property market. We talked about the gap between the number of households and the number of properties on the deeds register. But that would be even smaller if we didn't have the GSP portion of the market. Now, of course, there's been a backlog in delivering title deeds to properties that were built by government, to RDP homes. A number of beneficiaries for a number of years have received their property, are living in the house, but don't actually have the title deed registered at the deeds office. So if those were added to the numbers that we have in the deeds office, then we'd see an even larger proportion that is government's contribution to the residential property market. The bar graph on the right is interesting because it takes each of those market segments and asks how much of this was GSP. And I mentioned before that in under 300,000 segment, about 70% of those properties were subsidized by government. Looking at the 300 to 600, it's about 43%. And then in the 600 to 900,000 range, it's about 14%. So it's a really significant component of the market that's existing. And so the performance of those properties that were government subsidized, how are they performing in the market? Are they trading? Are they appreciating? It's a critical question. And it's critical because it speaks to the economic asset component of a house for households, right? We had spoken about how households provide shelter, but they also perform as an economic asset. And how well they're doing in that performance can be determined by looking at these GSP properties in the context of housing beneficiaries. So the majority of RDP properties are in Gauteng in the Western Cape, which is not surprising. But I think it's important to mention that in those smaller provinces, in your Free State and the Northern Cape, the government-subsidized properties make up almost 1/2 of the existing properties on the deeds registry. So they're a massive component. Which begs the question about how are our first-time homeowners entering the property market? Because if we're going to talk about access to housing and access to housing finance, then the pathways that first-time homeowners use to get onto the property ladder in the first place is really critical. We want to ask questions about how that's happening. So if you look at the pie graph, the orange is the resale market. So we have this massive national housing program, right? Sorry, I just need to move this. Here we go. Okay, we have this massive national housing program, but of all the first-time homeowners that became homeowners in 2023, there's about 93,000 of them. Of that group of households, right, only 20%, only 16% received a house from government, right? The rest of them accessed a house in another way, and most of them were through the resale market, right? So about 66% of those first-time homeowners were purchasing an existing home in the resale market, right? And some of those homes that they purchased, existing housing, was actually GSP, right? It was government-subsidized properties that they bought from the beneficiary or from the inheritor of the property from the beneficiary. So that's really important to look at in terms of different pathways to home ownership, right? About 16% are receiving properties, that they're beneficiaries of government housing, right? About 20%, mostly higher income, are purchasing new housing. And about 66% are going to the resale market, right? And purchasing an existing property. And for that, they need finance. But my point here on this slide is to say that the resale market is the main entry point for first-time homeowners to obtain property. Right? And so the functioning of the resale market is critically important, right? Is the information there? Is there housing finance available? Is the market functioning properly? Will be a key determinant of whether people become first-time homeowners. So apart from government's investment in housing, we also want to look, hey, what are private developers building? Right? If we take out the GSP from the picture, what are private developers building? And by private developers, I mean both households that build houses themselves and also your regular private developer who has land, purchases and develops the properties and the housing and sells them, right? And that can be in the affordable housing sector. So the bar graph on the left looks at metros versus outside the metros, which would be any of your local municipalities. So that would include intermediate cities. But you can see essentially that what the private developers are building is, again, largely in the lower part of the market. It's those light blue, blue and green on the left-hand side. So 58% of new transactions that are not government subsidized are actually under 1.2 million. So not all of the investment by private developers is going into the upper end of the market. Of course, 1.2 million is very expensive, but the important point being that you're seeing a lot of investment below as well. The bar graph on the right talks about the different types of properties. So we can have freehold properties that are either inside a private estate or outside, and sectional title. Sectional title is often a more affordable means for households to become homeowners. So it's important to see the extent to which private developers are investing in sectional title and not just freehold properties. So you can see under the sectional title here that many of the units, the new units that are being built, are located in the metros. And that is a signal of densification, right? Because the sectional title will be more dense development, which both helps affordability and our spatial transformation. So I mentioned those RDP properties, the GSP. What is that? You'll remember that first-time homeowners, about 7 or 9% of them were buying RDP properties from existing beneficiaries. And this is a really interesting market to look at because there's a tremendous amount of potential here, right? We had mentioned that of those 300,000 of those properties that are under 300,000, about 70% of them are GSP. So what if the beneficiaries sitting in those households could go onto the resale market, and if they have the income and the means, move up the property ladder, and by doing so and selling their existing RDP, they then provide supply to the low-income market, right? People who want to step into home ownership. About 9% of the resale transactions were of government-subsidized properties in 2023. Okay. Now, this, of course, if we mentioned government subsidized property resale, the key question, of course, is around the resale restriction. So you'll be aware that RDP properties have a stipulation that makes it more difficult to sell if the RDP property is less than 8 years old. You're actually not forbidden to sell it, but you are required to go back to the province and offer it to the province first at no cost. So essentially, we want to look at how many of those properties are over 8 years old and therefore eligible to enter the market and act as supply at the lower end of the property ladder. Okay. So of those total resale transactions of government subsidized properties, about 17% of them were actually less than 8 years old. Right? So you can see in the graph on the bottom in 2023, there were about 13,000 RDP properties that were sold, and about 2,200 of those were actually less than 8 years old. So how did that happen? Well, some of the proponents of the resale restriction would probably say that those were illegal sales. Those were non-compliant, and they are some of them may be non-compliant. But the largest share of those 2,000 properties were in the Western Cape. And that's because the Western Cape has a program where households, if they want to sell their RDP, can apply to the province and say, we'd like to sell, we'd like a waiver for this restriction. We want your permission for us to go ahead and sell. And because the Western Cape has this program set up and it's functioning smoothly and people are aware of it, the large majority of those sales that are under 8 years old are happening in the Western Cape. And I think that's important. I'm not a proponent of the 8-year restriction, but it's interesting to see that that market is moving in places where it's allowed. Right. So the next question, of course, is that if I'm going to sell my RDP, are my potential buyers going to be able to access finance? And we saw when we looked that 30% of those RDP resales were financed with a mortgage, right? 30% of them, which means that 2/3 of them, people were using cash or other types of credit. The important point here is about the functioning of the property market, because generally, as general practice, a house will sell for more if it's financed with a bond. So the average resale transaction price with a mortgage was about $560,000. But if the buyer wasn't using a mortgage, then the average price was around $235,000, less than half. I think I just have this last slide, which is to ask about, well, how hard is it for low-income households to access a bond? So we use this data that we have to ask that question. So overall, the number of bonded transactions in the country actually dropped quite sharply in 2023. And I think that's largely because of the hikes in the prime rate and the interest rate. So the difference between bonded transactions in 2022 and 2023 was a drop of about 25%. Right? So that's the overall context that we're looking at here. Now, if you see the bar graph on the left, this is the percent of transactions in each market segment that were financed with a mortgage. And you can see that once you go above 600,000, about 90, 80% of those transactions are financed with a bond from a formal bank. That percentage gets a little bit lower as we hit the top end of the property market, right? Because those are the wealthy purchasing properties. But you see this important cliff that happens between the 600 to 9,000 market segment and the 300 to 600. Right? So if you're under 600,000, about 74% of those mortgages are done with a bond. But the second you go over 600,000 into the next market segment, it's about 90%. So that would suggest a hesitancy by formal banks to drop below that 600,000 mark. Now, the reason for such the low percentage in the under 300,000 is, of course, what we mentioned before, that most of those properties are transactions whereby the government is registering RDP property at the deeds office. So those don't need to be financed with a bond. So we are seeing the entry of formal banks into the lower ends of the market, particularly Standard Bank and FNB. They're most active at the lower end. And about 50% of those bonds that are under 900,000 are coming from those two providers of finance. So this is an overall picture. I hope it gives you a sense of where households on the lower end of the property market, where they can enter the property market, how difficult it is, and how hard it is to access housing finance. Thank you very much. I hope I was somewhat within time.
You were, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Alison, for really drilling down into this property market and giving us a realistic picture of what's happening and what we